The Ring of Power has surfaced in Dol Guldur, and factions all across Middle-earth are vying for power in The Lord of the Rings: Rise to War. Select your faction, build armies, and take over Middle-earth in this battle of wits. IGN sat down with Jacob over at NetEase Games to detail everything coming in this geostrategic war game presented by NetEase Games. Hello, my name is Alan Wheeler, and joining me today is Jacob from NetEase Games. Welcome.
Hi, Alan. Thanks.
So I have to ask, which of the Nazgul are you?
Well, I am Kamul, who is the most readily available Nazgul in our game at this time.
What is The Lord of the Rings: Rise to War?
So, according to our own parlance, it is a geostrategic war game. What does that mean? That means it is a strategy game that's based on specific control of land area. And so what we do is we take a proud and proven strategic game model and apply it to Middle-earth, giving players the, sandbox that they can reenact any of the various fantasies they've had about the Lord of the Rings franchise since the movies came out.
Now let's talk about the Lord of the Rings franchise. What was the perfect setting for this geostrategic war game?
Well, Middle-earth is the setting in the Lord of the Rings franchise that players are most familiar with. It's a large continent with many locations to be explored, many familiar places and places unfamiliar as well. So in terms of our gameplay type, where we need vast swaths of lands for players to occupy, battle in, and interact with, it was the perfect setting.
What are some of the locations that fans of The Lord of the Rings should keep an eye out for when playing the game?
Well, up until now, we've basically recreated the entirety of the map as is known according to the 3 books. So if there are any locations in the books that the players are aware of, they're all there to be found.
Sounds like a fun world to explore. What sort of iconic heroes are available for players to use in their factions?
Essentially, anyone that you could imagine that has appeared in the books or the movies will all be there. Fan favorites such as Legolas, Gimli, Frodo, the other hobbits, Aragorn, Gandalf, Boromir, all of them are there, as well as heroes on the evil side, such as Sauron, the Mouth of Sauron, the Witch King, Lurtz, Saruman, and so on and so forth, as well as a few heroes that we have added based on our own research and experience.
Now you mentioned adding characters original to the game. How did you go about crafting those factions?
We haven't added any original factions yet. Every faction that we've added so far has had some sort of basis in the lore. As for characters from those factions, we will do in-depth analysis of the lore to try to paint a picture of what characters from these factions would be like. What would their names sound like? What would they look like? How would they behave? And we take a look at where we feel like the lore didn't describe quite enough to satiate players' curiosity, and then build out from there.
Is The Lord of the Rings: Rise to War set in the Third Age? Does it follow immediately after Frodo's journey to Mount Doom?
It's not necessarily set in the Third Age per se. We don't have a strict setting. More what we're trying to convey is that it's a sandbox that comprises all the content of the books, and players can sort of interpret that how they will.
Why did the Ring of Power surface in Dol Guldur?
So we had to find a location that was relatively central on the map. This way all players from their starting positions in their various factions' homelands would have a relatively equal distance and equal shot at approaching the ring. I think moreover, because Dol Guldur is mentioned in the Hobbit series as being sort of the temporary charging spot of Sauron when he's in the necromancer form, we thought it would be appropriate to have his Ring of Power appear there.
What was your favorite The Lord of the Rings location or character to work on?
Well, I'm the map designer, and so I love all of my creations equally. The entire map I am equally proud of in all of its corners and nooks and crannies.
As a Nazgul, is there a favorite area of the map to fly over?
Favorite area of the map to fly over? Probably the Dead Marshes. It's very familiar, very homey, you know.
What factions are currently in the game and how do they differ?
All the factions that you would expect, plus some that perhaps players would not be quite as familiar with. So on the good side, we have Lothlorien, Erebor, Rohan, Gondor, with the addition of the Linden Elves in certain servers and seasons. And then on the evil side, we have, again, what you would expect with Isengard, Mordor, Angmar, which might be sort of unfamiliar to some players, and Rhûn, which would also probably be unfamiliar to many players. One of the things that we're trying to do with the factions is give players a chance to experience content that is sort of briefly mentioned in the movies, like the Soldiers of Rhûn, and then expand on other book content, such as the Varyags that we've added recently, or the Gundabad Orcs, which again is another recent addition. They're all sort of briefly touched on, at least, or referenced in some way, but not explored to the extent that I think a lot of players would want. And so we want to really give players the opportunity to explore things in the IP that they might not have had the chance to become familiar with previously.
Do certain factions have specific gameplay mechanics that other factions don't?
I would say broadly no. What they have more is they have unique elements and things like that. For example, the most obvious one is that when you choose a faction, obviously you attain their special city model, and so you look different, you look like that faction would look. You gain access to units that faction would be using, and then you start from their unit tree before branching out into other factions' unit trees. And when you choose a faction, you get a faction bonus that is unique to that faction as well. So in terms of pure functionality, I would say all factions are equal, but there are interesting details to be found in the differences between each faction.
So what about the runes Easterlings? Maybe not all the fans would be familiar with them, so what makes them unique?
So the Easterlings are actually very interesting. Sadly, at this point in time, they're slightly underappreciated in terms of faction choice for most players, but I personally think they're the most interesting because they're only shown very, very briefly in the movies. In the scenes where we have Sam and Frodo, I want to say it's approaching the Black Gate, and they're hiding sort of on a mountainside looking down, and you see an army coming out of the gates in sort of golden disc-shaped helmets and burgundy armor on their bodies. That is the Easterling army. And so in the movies, you're only given really that much of an exposure to this faction. But within the lore itself, they have a very rich history and a very sort of storied involvement with Sauron and the War of the Ring. And so it's a very present and very important part of the lore that the movies don't really give you a chance to explore. And so most of the content is, you could say, not really created, but fleshed out by us. In terms of new content or unique content, this is something that we can really offer that other entries in the franchise haven't.
Now, how will the results of Season 1 affect how Season 2 begins?
In general, our seasons aren't really affected by one another. They're sort of contained instances of gameplay, and that's part of our sort of broader appeal, is that if you play Season 1, regardless of how you place, you'll have a fresh start in Season 2. So compared to perhaps other strategy games where you have instances of power creep because players who are strong will just remain strong indefinitely, for us, once you complete a season, you get a new start where you get to keep your commanders and your items and other things, but then your levels and everything else resets, and then the goal for the season becomes either augmented or completely new, or new gameplay elements are added. So the seasons by design are independent, but players' accounts will have a certain amount of continuity to them.
What sort of additions are coming to the Lord of the Rings Rise to War?
We're sort of transitioning from the season concept into a campaign concept. We're working on a campaign that will focus on the War of the Ring. So this is something players have been asking for a long time. Season content that more specifically explores IP-related events, and we'll be delivering it as soon as we can.
And how do these additions change the game?
For example, if you're talking about season goals and things like that, each season will have a unique and independent goal, or a unique sort of gameplay gimmick. And whereas in previous seasons, the goal has often just been to occupy Dol Guldur and seize the ring for yourself, in the upcoming season, the goal will be more in line with the mainline story of the movies. So the way that players experience the game will undergo a serious change.
Now, fans of the original movies and original book series should be excited for Season 4. Do you mind telling the viewers why?
Season 4 will be focusing on the War of the Ring, the story that's conveyed by the books and movies. So instead of our more sort of fast and loose interpretation with the Dol Guldur and factional war in previous seasons, Season 4 will be focusing more purely on a struggle between good and evil for the fate of the ring.
Now, what role will the Fellowship of the Ring play?
Good players, essentially, will be trying to aid the Fellowship of the Ring in its quest to deliver the ring to Mount Doom. Meanwhile, players on the evil side will be doing their best to try to hinder the progress of the Fellowship of the Ring while accomplishing their goal of conquering Middle-earth.
And we've heard rumors of a spring festival. What sort of surprises does it bring for players?
There will be all manner of festivities, gardening minigames, trivia, and as always, rewards to be had.
Sounds like a fun time. Thank you so much for joining me, Jacob. The Lord of the Rings Rise to War is available now for free on iOS and Google Play Store. And for more on all things gaming, stay tuned to IGN.com.